Hey, and good morning, everybody, and welcome to our episode of Valiant Live, where we're talking about network infrastructure. That's sort of like our core, kind of sticking with our core kind of underlying pieces and this and thing. But before we get started, I just want to introduce our co-hosts. I guess that's way to put it. Gina is Giant CIO. Marian Dobrovolsky is our training manager, and Megan Quick works with me in the sales. So it's excellent. Thank you all for joining me today. And that's who we are. We're Valiant Technology. We're a managed service provider located in New York. We work with small medium businesses, both in New York and throughout the country. So pretty exciting stuff. And before we get into our episode around networks, backup storage, we want to kind of stop our normal output and talk a little bit more about the Kaseya breach that was in the national news this past week. It was a really big event for our industry. Most people don't know what a managed service provider is, and and it was such a massive kind of frightening attack. So I just want to go through it. So, I mean, Justin, maybe you can kind of give us like the rundown. We can go backwards and forwards in there.
Sure. Yeah. So what uh, what happened with the players in it really is Kaseya, a company that does a large number of different products, different services. We use some products from Kaseya. I believe we had someone from Kaseya back, what was it, in May,
That's right.
was on the stream. So we do work with them. Now, we don't use the specific product that was involved in this, which is their VSA product, which is a type of software and service called RMM, remote monitoring and management, or remote monitoring and maintenance software. It's a standard tool that MSPs and other IT providers use. It's basically an agent that gets installed onto workstations and servers and does everything from, doing, it says remote monitoring, so doing things like checking for alerts, checking for problems, but also doing maintenance things like making sure updates are run, or bringing in inventory, or even just looking at like what software is installed. So it's a powerful piece of software that runs and is used by MSPs, by IT providers, to do the work that they do. And what happened with this particular incident, some of the details are still being looked into, and some of the details are not being made public because it's still actively going on. But there was a there was a group that discovered a 0-day, and it was not published out yet. It was a potential problem with the code that needed to be patched and updated. Before that patch was able to go out, to be developed and go out, a threat actor, a hacker group, I think the term that is being used is a privateer group.
Privateer,
Essentially, it's a group called Revil, or Revil, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's REVIL, and they operate out of Russia and other countries. And the general idea is that there's a blind eye turned to them by the governments of the countries that they're in, because they're not targeting those particular countries. They are a sophisticated organization, organized crime, a sophisticated group that makes it their job to send out ransomware and find vulnerabilities and collect ransom. Like that's
right.
That's what they do. That's
It's a nice server you have here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it.
Very much so. And they're
Yes.
the same folks. They're the same folks that claimed the JBS, that large meat packing breach and a ransomware attack. So they're pretty well known in the industry. Their names popped up so much in the past couple months, and so we're seeing it all the time. So, and that's what's really interesting. How with the Kaseya, this kind of attack. I mean, Justin, kind of as you're preparing for this, it's such a complex.
What they were able to find this 0-day, this bug that was in the system, in the code that hadn't been patched yet, and use that to distribute ransomware. Because it's a tool that's used by managed service providers and IT professionals to support their clients, in some ways it's partially a supply chain attack. It's not in the truest sense. When you
Right.
think about a supply chain attack, that's like, if we look at like what happened with SolarWinds, that's where the code itself that is signed and produced by somebody that's writing it, the company that's producing it, is malicious in itself. Something got slipped into it. This
Right.
wasn't that. This was a 0-day. This was a bug in the code that was in the process of being updated, just hasn't been done yet. That was discovered and taken advantage of. But because it was in a tool that's being used not by something directly used by the companies that got affected, in that sense, it's kind of like a supply chain attack, because it was a tool that's on a machine that's doing something. And yeah, what happened was that some systems were compromised, and ransomware was run to lock up those systems and request a ransom to do it. I think they initially asked for $70 million, and they said they
Correct.
would do all of them, or you could negotiate individually for just your data if you wanted to negotiate with them.
Mm.
And it reverberated through the MSP community.
Sure.
There were, I mean, immediately we were seeing lots of organizations. I think Huntress was one of the ones that took the lead in the
Hmm.
beginning, but even just in the community, we were seeing, uh, MSPs that were affected, you know, talking about what was going on, and MSPs that weren't affected saying, "Hey, I'm not affected by this. I have extra bandwidth. Is there anything I can do to help?" And that was great to see for us,
Right.
for just that community. A lot of times, IT folks can be very argumentative and have very, very distinct ideas about how things should
Right.
be done, and everything else is wrong. And but it was good to see people pull together,
Yeah.
and really help each other out in this. And
Well, I'm
uh,
sure. I mean, one of the reasons that happens is, as we said, last stream and many previous streams, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. It
exactly.
could be any of us.
Hmm.
Right.
So, this time it was, Kaseya and their RMM agent, but, we all need to prepare for these sort of doomsday scenarios. So I think that's
Sure.
also
Hmm.
a big part of us helping each other because,
Yeah, absolutely,
it's
100%.
definitely something that will go throughout the whole community. So,
Right. And and a lot of this too is uh, in many scenarios in the past, people didn't assume that people talk about a lot of providers and they're not planning for the actual event of the tool being the vector.
Right.
So I think that's a kind
Hmm.
of a sea change in terms of the industry and how it should be approached. Is that there is a day that every tool you have may be suspect, and
Yeah.
what's going to happen then, and how you're going to work, and what's the response look like. And once again, it goes back to having that preparedness for the incident and our the worst case scenario, which is the cool, and also the timing. I think is really
Mhm.
important,
Yeah.
and
mhm,
everyone, a lot of folks, a lot of things you read about are, hey, this happened on a holiday weekend, but that's when people's minds and they're not in the office. People take off for a holiday.
Yeah.
Um, you
No,
know,
there was code to, like, when we were examining how the attack actually happened. It was set with a countdown so that it all started at exactly the same time. It was planned to take place exactly when it took place for a particular reason, which is it was early afternoon Friday before a
right,
holiday weekend. It was exactly
mhm.
the kind of time when everybody would be thinking about, just wrapping up and getting out early that day, and then all
correct,
of
Yeah.
a sudden none of their stuff works, and
yep,
right before a holiday. So that the timing was on purpose.
Mhm.
The setup for it, I mean, it was coordinated. It was well executed. And yeah, there's a lot of people were talking about things like, "Oh, you could have done this," or, "Oh, you should have done that." And the truth of the matter is, like you said, it's not if but when. You have to assume that every piece of software, technology, or hardware that you have at some point is either going to break or be breached, or something is going to happen, and you have to have the contingencies in place for it.
correct,
And
Mhm.
uh, Kaseya, for their part, when they realized what was going on, they shut off their system. They pulled the plug
disable it.
on, yeah,
Yeah.
even on systems that were not affected. There's two types of servers. You can run your own server for the RMM tool, or you could use their hosted cloud. There's no evidence that it was affecting
The
their
host.
cloud service.
Hmm.
but they shut it down just to be safe, to make sure. And that's something that you can say, like, oh, how could this happen? But they had at least some level of a contingency plan because they were able to do that and do that rather quickly. It's not like something
Right.
they had to scramble to figure out how to do. So
Yeah.
It's a great question to ask any company you work with, any third party vendor, any partner you have, any even your own clients. Like, hey, are you guys prepared? Do you have a incident response plan? Do you have a business continuity plan?
Mhm.
And I think that's going to get us to our next segment,
Yep.
which is backup. But just kind of wrap up the Kaseya thing. It's a really scary thing. The damage wasn't as bad as it could have possibly have been if it had been more widespread. But I think um, every service provider and every IT professional and every business really needs to take this as a really kind of, if you don't need any more warnings,
Yeah.
this is the one,
If
because
you've been watching,
if you, yeah, exactly. I mean, as we were preparing for this, we were laughing. Was there's terms like RMM, Kaseya, managed service provider. No one's ever heard of these things until this weekend, and now
everybody's an expert.
everyone's expert. Everyone's heard it. So
Well, if you've heard it and you're not sure, we
Yeah.
can
reach
Know some
out.
people who can help you out there. Yeah.
Exactly. Give you some more information about those things. So, backup. We just want to go through some fundamentals, because I think that the best do the basic best. That sounds a little off, but really, really you do things, the basics really well. You get in the fundamentals, everything gets much easier. And backup is a fundamental IT process or fundamental IT system that has to be in place. And once again, in an attack like this, and where all your data is encrypted, having a backup that's hardened and protected against that is really important. So let's talk about backup then. JP, you want to kick us off, and then we'll kind of walk through it.
Yeah, I was a total definitely echo what you're saying about backup being critical to security. It isn't in the security. When we talk about our pyramid, we have the baseline is stability, and security is the tier above that. And a lot of the question for that is, if we're why wouldn't security be first? Part of that is, yeah, you need something that is stable and running in order to
Right.
properly secure it. And backup goes into the stability section because it really is the ability for you to keep things running when something happens.
Right.
You can't say that your environment is stable if you can't, recover from a mistake or recover
Right.
from something happening. It's just like anything else. Like you have a spare tire in your car, so that if you get a flat tire, you can put the spare in. Backup is the same.
Right.
It's you're not considered stable without it.
Mhm.
And I think, George, the phrase that I've heard you say many times, and I think is great, is you're only as good as your last good backup. So,
And let's get back, or you want to take it one further. Last good restoration,
yeah, really, the last good
because
True.
restore test.
backup in and of itself does not mean anything. I mean,
You can't get the
you can't
data.
get the data. I mean, we could
Mhm.
regale you with stories of
Yeah,
backups of gone wrong, and tape drives and this, that, and the other thing. But the reality is that you have to test backups. You have to know they're working,
Mhm.
and you have to make it effort. It's a core function of any IT provider, any IT team.
Mhm.
I think it should be something we think about from day in, day out.
mhm,
And any system that comes online has to be thought of as, well, how do we back this up? How do we
yep,
protect this?
yep.
Yeah.
And we generally, and I'm just going to be very general, and this is an oversimplification, but it's a good way to start. You can generally break backups down into two
Mhm.
types: file based or image based. We say file based is just copying files, which is great if what you need to protect is just file data.
Right.
So you can think about if you plug in a USB drive and drag and drop all your work documents onto it. That's a
Mhm.
file based backup. You've saved the files. uh, Image based is more of like a snapshot of the entire system. It's
Mhm.
a way of restoring the computer or the server or whatever it is back exactly the way it was, not just returning the file. So if you think about, if you copy all of your files to an external hard drive as your backup, and your computer dies completely, you've got
Mhm.
all of your files, but in order to get back up and running, you're going to need to, get your computer, reinstall Windows, reinstall all the
Right.
software, make sure
Right.
Office is on there, and then put your files back in.
Right.
Whereas image-based is you just get the hardware and tell it, restore my old everything back to this machine, and it does it the same way that it was.
Correct. Yeah, and yeah, think about the time. Just if you want to think about from a time perspective, why image-based, especially for workstation servers, this thing, how long it takes to install Office,
Yeah.
how long it takes to get all those that download your email again, to get all those little preferences in place, and and that adds a lot of time to a restoration. So while
Absolutely.
once again, it better to have always good, if you have to pick one or the other, image is usually better, but if it if you have to take in consideration the time it takes to restore the applications and
Sure.
the environment.
Especially, yep. And for workstations, we tend to do either
We do both.
file-based or both. I mean,
Yep.
Yeah.
it's a file-based, even tools just like OneDrive or Dropbox or Google Drive, things like that, where you can save your files and it's copying them to a cloud storage. That can be a file-based backup for the
Correct.
data. And again, if your machine dies, you're like, okay, no problem. I'm going to log into my second computer and go to the web and find it, and that's okay. Image-based, we use a product from a company called Datto that does an image-based backup of the workstation, and that you can restore the whole thing. And that's really important, especially if you have running applications. Like if you're running
Correct.
QuickBooks off of your machine, backing up the QuickBooks file is super important. But backing up the entire system so that you can restore it and get it all back
Right.
is that. And servers tend to be image-based backup as well.
Right. Exactly. I was going to say the one that was in my mind is the architect or the person who do design work, and
Yeah.
they have every application, those preferences. And if you ever set up a design station with a printer's profile, a
Yeah.
couple hours of work. So
Yeah.
it's like
So,
you want to make sure that you get these folks back operational. So
so that's two types. The other two things to take into consideration with backup are: is it local or offsite? And there's pros and cons to both. Usually, when we're designing backup, we do both. And the reason for that is local is much faster to back up, much faster to restore because it's right there. So it's like saying if you've got, your terabyte external drive with a terabyte of files, it's a lot faster to copy those files over from that drive than to have to download them, which would be offsite. Offsite isn't just cloud, though. You can do things like drive rotation. So you have, 3 hard drives so that you always have one somewhere safe offsite, one plugged in, and a third one that you use for transit. So if anything happens, you always have 2 copies of your data somewhere. Or tape rotation, doing the same thing. Services like Iron Mountain let do that, where they'll store a copy to have a copy for transport, and you have yours, and you just prepare it for them, and they'll do that. Those tend to be good for very large data sets. Most small businesses are looking at cloud storage as offsite
Correct. Yeah.
because it's just over the internet. It's just easier, and especially if it's a workstation, it works anywhere. So my laptop backs up as long as I'm on the internet. I was visiting my family over the holiday weekend, and I didn't have to worry if something happened to my laptop. If I was working, would it be restorable? Yeah, it was all there because I had an internet connection.
Right.
So really local and offsite. There's also we look at backup for cloud services. Uh, Being in the cloud, and I think we're going to talk a little about this
Yep.
more later too. But being in the cloud, something in the cloud doesn't mean that it's backed up. You do want to have something to actually back up that data to make sure that that data is in more than just the cloud provider in the primary place. There are services that do that to back up things like Office 365 or Google, because they're really on that shared responsibility model, where if you delete something, it's deleted. It's not really you told them to delete it, so they deleted it. So you do want to have that kind of protection as well too.
Right. It's really critical to think about having data in the cloud does not absolve you of the responsibility for the data being restorable and accessible to your staff at all times.
Yeah, you
I
still
think it's
need
really
to make sure
important.
that you can get stuff back if something happens. I mean, it could be
Absolutely.
anything from stuff got deleted, stuff got moved, or if you, let's say you are with a cloud provider and have a billing dispute and they disable access, and it's
Right.
like, where's your now your critical data is logged. Make sure you have it backed up in something else, and
Right.
you can know that you've got that.
Yeah.
So I guess the next part of backup is, we hear a lot about backup versus disaster recovery versus business continuity, and we could do we've done a whole episodes on
Yeah.
those, but in a nutshell, backup is just the actual copy or of a system or data. Your disaster recovery is planning to is a planning for a more of, over getting the system working again, and business continuity is just defined in by many people by more about the business impact and actually restoring business operations versus looking at the system in and of itself. So sometimes one's very much like a technology function. The other one is very much like a business function. So they're very interwoven, but you can't have one without the other. But they're
But they're
distinct.
not the same
They're not
thing.
the same, and there's different practitioners in a business or organization to be responsible for different parts. In the business continuity plan, you want to make sure that the leadership's really involved in it. Disaster recovery, they're not going to, or backup, they're not going to really worry about that you missed your tape rotation that day. So it's kind of a different. They may care about it if the business continuity plan can't be executed, but that's an important part. So that's great. It's so much information. We're probably going to come back quite a bit of this because this is such a deep topic for us.
Yeah.
We're really obsessed with backup as a company, I think. So I think it's a really important thing. So our next segment is this networking. Is it actually the physical aspect of moving data from one system to another? This is one thing. This is a building block. It seems something that you don't think about very often because it's kind of, especially in most offices, it's in a closet or some kind of hidden away. It's out of sight, out of mind. But I assure you, when the network doesn't work, everything doesn't work.
Yep.
And just to kind of quickly give it a breakdown, there's a lot of different networking components that can go into a network. But in the fundamentals of its like core, what it does, there's usually like a router that sits at the front of the network that takes traffic and moves it from one location to another. Usually behind that router, we always recommend putting a firewall that inspects traffic for its. We're not going to get into the nuances of a router and a packet filter, but anyway, you can get yourself in a kind of a spiral. But a firewall, and just maybe give us a little firewall 101.
Yeah, a firewall at its core just says whether or not traffic is allowed through, yes or no. And it's kind of like the bouncer sitting at the front door. It says, okay, this matches rules that say you're allowed, or this doesn't match rules that say you're allowed. So traffic is allowed through or traffic is blocked. And that can be, simple things like always let the internet work, or it can be more complicated things like inspect all the traffic that's coming through and run it through an antivirus engine to make sure it's not something known bad or things along those lines.
Right. The best the reason why it's called a firewall, if you think about the name of itself, it segments two pieces that are away from each other that you don't want to interact. The classic in a car, it's actually called a firewall in the car. It's the part between the engine bay and the passenger compartment. So if you think of it that way, but there's still holes punched through that firewall to allow heating and cooling, controls, electronics, that sort of thing. So that's a great analogy of it. If you think about a car and the interface between the front, I said the engine compartment to the passenger compartment. That's great. Kind of our next thing that's important is I mentioned earlier routers. They move data through different internet gateways and hubs. In terms of not hubs and the internet terminal hub, but like concentrated amounts of data storage, data movement. So
generally you find routers and firewalls on the same device, on the same
correct.
Thing. They're kind of interchangeable. You can have standalone routers that just do routing and firewalls that just do firewalling, but usually it's, when you think about a firewall, it's also a router.
Correct. Especially small, medium businesses. As you get larger enterprises, each role gets segmented and isolated. And last, we're really going to talk about more is a switch. Also, in the past, used to be called a hub. They're kind of different. They do the same thing, but they do it differently. Switches are much more reliable. They're much faster. They move data from one location to another through a network by addresses. It knows there's a bunch of it's really important that that you have switches that work properly. They move data, they segment networks, they segment data, and ideally here, switches are something you don't really talk about very often. But you want to make sure you put ones in that are very reliable, and it can impact the network's location. That's why we generally almost always use managed switches, so we have visibility into the network and we can watch the traffic and analyze it for problems.
The firewall tends to get the the notoriety and the press of something, but the switch is the real backbone. That's the piece that actually makes the connection between your computer and everything else, the servers, the internet. And that's true if you're on wireless as well. We're not really going to dive into wireless now because that's a whole separate complicated piece. But even if you're on wireless, it's the best way I've heard of it is that it's not no wires, it's less wires, because the wireless is connected to the switch, which then is running everything else. So
and that even goes for your cell phone. But that's going to be a whole episode we're going to do about cellular, 5G, wireless, radio spectrum. All right. So, and finally, kind of our building block is storage, which is something that, depending on which kind of work you do, you may not ever think about storage because you might have a small amount of storage, Word files and documents, that sort of thing. And that might be less, but if you work on large files or video editing, large data sets, storage gets really critical and really important. So, Justin, take us through storage.
Yeah, there's data that lives in your computer on hard drive or now in SSD drives. And there's different ways to build that data. When you're doing, like you said, something smaller, it's called either internal or direct attach. That's when, that's the hard drive that's in your computer, or that's the hard drive that's inside the server that's there. There's also external storage when you think about on your laptop or something, that's like plugging in a drive. For servers, it's more than just plugging something in. There is a separate physical appliance. It's a server, a storage server, and these can either be a NAS, which is a network attached storage, or a SAN, which is a storage area network. The difference between the two are at this point very muddled because they both basically almost all of them can do all of the same things. But the idea between them is that it's a way to present that storage, that space, to other systems, to a server.
Shared storage. Multiple systems can utilize the same storage pool or same storage area network.
And when we think about storage in a laptop or in a desktop, you have a hard drive. You have the one hard drive. Maybe you have two. You have a small fast SSD and then a big drive for large files. When you think about a server, you've got storage usually in what's called a RAID, which, depending on who you ask, is a redundant array of independent disks or redundant array of inexpensive disks. Inexpensive, not so much anymore, but the idea there is that you take, let's say you have one drive, you have your data's on one drive, something happens to that drive, you lose access to that data. So you take two drives and you mirror it. Something happens to one drive, well, the data's still on that drive. That can be sometimes slower, sometimes faster. So then you can also do things where you can take three drives and you have your data, it's called striped, and parity. And these, I think we did a
whole episode on
but the idea is that your data lives across all three drives and you can lose a drive and not lose any data. And then there's other degrees of RAID. Well, it's RAID 6 where it's spread across, you need 4 drives, but you can lose 2 drives and not lose any data. And there's other variations of that.
I mean, essentially it's for resilience. So whether or not it's being replicated or however the RAID is set up, minimal or maximal.
It's to make, you can make the storage faster and more resilient than just a single drive by having more drives. And that's when you look, when you see the pictures of the server rack and it's just drive after drive after drive, and that to maximize that speed and protection. But like I mentioned before, cloud is not a backup. RAID is not a backup either.
RAID is not a backup.
Having a mirror drive, this is a redundancy. It saves you from, if a drive fails, you're not down. But if you delete a file, it's gone. If your system gets encrypted, it's gone, because it's a live mirror of those two things. There's no extra copy of it. It's just, we're saving you from this is really the spare tire. It's the or the run flat tire. It's like, yeah, hey,
Right.
you ran over a nail, but you can keep driving till you get to the gas station. But if you crash the car, having the run is like, but I have run flats. It won't make a difference.
Right. Exactly.
So that's important to have, but it's not the same as a backup. But it is, especially in servers, really critical to have a RAID system that's set up properly and designed properly. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen systems which use there's a RAID that's called RAID 0, which is data that's split across 2 or more drives to make it faster, but it's actually less reliable than a single drive, because if you lose a drive, you lose all your data. There's no way to recover it at all.
3 points of failure. That'll just turn it all off.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's absolutely very specific use cases for RAID 0 that we'll maybe get into next week when we talk about databases. I've seen that where it goes there. Thank you, Matt. Transient data. Data that sometimes it's logging. It's things that you may not need. It may be like scratch data if you're doing video editing. And once again, going back to that work, but it's really not the idea. So anyway, this is a really important and deep kind of thing. So anyway, I guess from that's a lot of information for today. I don't know, guys. I think we're done. I think we got to wrap it up.
I learned a lot today. I have to say.
No, thanks. No, I appreciate. I kind of know the Kaseya thing kind of pushed us a little bit past our. This is a really important thing. And once again, if you have questions or anything you want to know about Valiant, please check us out. Here's a link, the Bitly link for us, and we would love answering questions. We love talking to folks about this topic. We're really passionate about it. And so anyway, next week we're going to talk about keep our theme of infrastructure and talk about what is a server and what is a database. Why are they the same? Why are they different? Are they interrelated to one another? And so we're going to keep talking about the stability. And I hope everyone really enjoyed this stream. And if you have any questions, please send to us. And I can't wait to see you all next week. All right. Thanks, Marian.
Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, Justin. All right. Bye now.
Everyone.
Bye.